Good evening, and welcome to the webinar series entitled Engaging Christianities and Socialisms. Tonight, we offer the first of three webinars entitled What Have Christianity and Socialism to Do with Each Other? These webinars are sponsored jointly by the Wendland-Cook Program in Religion and Justice and the Institute for Christian Socialism. My name is Angela Kauser. I'll be your moderator tonight. Dr. Aaron Stauffer will be our timekeeper. The Wendland-Cook Program in Religion and Justice, an interdisciplinary program located at Vanderbilt University Divinity School, focuses on issues of justice that arise at the intersection of religion, economics, and ecology. Founded in 2019 by Dr. Joerg Rieger and supported by a generous gift from Barbara Wendland, the mission of the program is to develop resources and opportunities for students, scholars, clergy, and activists to envision and create a more just and sustainable world for all. Our second sponsor is the Institute for Christian Socialism, or ICS, which is an ecumenical institute founded on the conviction that the socialism of the gospel is irreconcilable with capitalism and demands Christian participation in the emergence of new forms of political economy today. The Institute is also founded on the belief that both traditionalist and progressive churches are failing to grasp not only the depth of capitalism's control over Christian existence today, but also the roles that they play in sustaining it. ICS is therefore organized to address the need for collaborative attempts to analyze our present political, social, and economic situations, and to support the construction of democratic, sustainable, and just social relationships that facilitate our transition beyond capitalism. Our purpose in organizing these webinars are fivefold. First, to lift up Christian socialism. Second, to be thought leaders in the work of upbuilding Christian socialist movements. Third, to boost the profiles of Wendland-Cook and the Institute of Christian Socialism. 4, to revive and reclaim emancipatory socialist Christianity. And 5, to build power. I'd like to, before we begin the panel, introduce our panelists tonight, of which there are 3. The first is Dr. Cynthia Moe-Lobeda. She serves as Professor of Theological and Social Ethics at Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary of California Lutheran University, Church Divinity School of the Pacific, and the Graduate Theological Union, where she serves on the core doctoral faculty. Dr. Moe-Lobeda is also the director of the new Center for Climate Justice and Faith at Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary. She is the author of many award-winning books and articles. She has lectured or consulted in Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, and many parts of North America in theology and matters of climate justice, economic justice, environmental racism, economic globalization, moral agency, public church, and eco-feminist theology. Dr. Moe-Lobeda, welcome tonight. Our second panelist is Dr. Joerg Rieger, who serves as the Distinguished Professor of Theology, Cal Turner Chancellor's Chair of Wesleyan Studies, and the founding director of the Wendland-Cook Program in Religion and Justice at Vanderbilt University. Dr. Rieger is author and editor of 24 books and over 160 academic articles. His works have been translated into Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, Croatian, German, Malayalam, Korean, and Chinese. Our third panelist tonight is Dr. Cornel West. Dr. West is a prominent and provocative democratic intellectual. He has taught at Yale University, Harvard University, the University of Paris, Princeton University, and most recently, Union Theological Seminary in New York. He graduated magna cum laude from Harvard University in 3 years and obtained his MA and PhD in philosophy at Princeton University. He has written 20 books and has edited 13. Dr. West is currently the Victor S. Thomas Professor of the Practice of Public Philosophy at Harvard University. Dr. West, welcome to this panel tonight. We are very, very glad to have you, Dr. Rieger, and Dr. Moe-Lobeda here with us. Just a note that all three of our panelists serve as members of the ICS, the Institute for Christian Socialism Advisory Board. My name is the Reverend Dr. Angela Kauser. I currently serve as Associate Professor of Black Church Studies and Associate Dean of Black Church Studies and Doctor of Ministry programs at Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. I previously served as Director of the Center for the Church and the Black Experience and Assistant Professor of the Sociology of Religion at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary on the campus of Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. I'm an ordained minister of Word and Sacrament in the Presbyterian Church USA and 20 years organizing with the Industrial Areas Foundation in the Southern United States. I'm a member of the Association of Black Sociologists, the National Center for Faculty Development and Diversity, the American Academy of Religion, and the Institute of Christian Socialism. I currently serve as co-chair on the board of ICS and am a member of the newly formed Black Mountain School of Theology and Community in Black Mountain, North Carolina. We are ready now for our panelists. So let me begin apace with question number 1 and an introduction to the three of you. For many people, American Christianity and organized religion have come to mean the religious right. Fascism, authoritarianism, white supremacy, patriarchy, misogyny, violence, a movement beset with grievances. At the same time, the number of Americans, especially younger generations, are more and more claiming the words socialism and democratic socialism. And yet, the intellectual and organizing energies for Christian socialism are emerging largely from outside churches. Question number 1, what does it mean for you at this time to care about both Christianity and socialism? We will start with Dr. Moe-Lobeda, then move to Dr. Rieger, and end with Dr. West.
Well, first, thank you, Reverend Dr. Kauser, and also thank you to the 2 organizational co-sponsors of this vital series. It is a privilege to be a part of this discussion. In short, I value democratic socialisms because of the God revealed by a dark-skinned Palestinian Jew named Jesus and the Hebrew prophets in whose footsteps he walked. As I see it, the biblical story is a magnificent, liberating, subversive love story. The source of all that is loves this world and each of us with a love that will not cease. This love is at work on earth to bring fullness of life for all. Therefore, this love seeks to dismantle or transform systems of oppression, systemic sin, because they thwart fullness of life. As the story goes, God calls the human creature to receive this love, to trust it and relish it, and then live it into the world. In the words of Jesus, you will love your neighbor as yourself. Or, in other translations, you will love your neighbor as God loves you. This is the heart of life for people of biblical faith. And it is in large part why I value democratic socialisms. Now, the implications of this wild, unruly story shake the foundations of economic life as we live it, because neighbor love does not concern only the interpersonal dimensions of life. No, neighbor love as a biblical calling pertains also to the ways in which we structure our lives together, and particularly our economic structures. Why? Why? Because economic systems determine life and death. They determine who will have food and water and who will not. Who will be paid enough to afford a roof, or who will sleep on the street after a hard day's work? Who will live by toxic waste dumps? Whose communities will be taken over by to build seaside resorts or Coca-Cola plants? Whose water will be sold on the global market? Economic decisions and practices can kill or protect. Clearly, followers of Jesus ought not kill, degrade, displace, or otherwise damage people. However, economic life as we live it, according to the norms and the demands of advanced global capitalism, do just that. This is the heart of the problem. Let me repeat. The systems of contemporary capitalism demand that we unwittingly betray the call to love neighbors, near and far, through what we buy, invest, consume, earn, toss out, and more. Capitalism, as we know it, betrays also the other primary rule for living given by God, the commandment to serve and preserve God's garden, Genesis 2:15. That is why building far more equitable and ecological political economies is inherent in following Jesus. Ecological and equitable are two central features of an economy acceptable from a Christian perspective. The third feature is democratic, where that word refers to accountable and equitably distributed power. This is why I value democratic socialisms. While highly varied and imperfect as are all human efforts, they have at their heart, in the words of Gary Dorian, a passion for social justice and radical democratic community, end quote. For Christians to heed God's central calling, our reason for being, to love neighbor with justice-seeking, earth-honoring love, entails joining with others to build economies that serve neighbors' well-being, with a particular attention to those who are vulnerable. This means building equitable, ecological, democratic, economic structures and policies and practices. That is the work of democratic socialisms. And here then is why I value both Christianity and democratic socialisms.
Thank you, Dr. Moe-Lobeda. Thank you very much. I'm going to go now to Dr. Rieger. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction, Dr. Kauser. Thanks for getting us started, Dr. Moe-Lobeda. This, in a way, reminds me, people don't remember this, but about 100 years ago in Texas, Northeast Texas, Southeastern Oklahoma, they had Christian Socialist camp meetings where they brought together as many as 10,000 people about 100 years ago. And we don't quite have 10,000 people today, but I believe we have a significant crowd. So I want to welcome everybody, and I'm really glad to be here and to have this conversation. So why care about Christianity and socialism? I have really two key words I want to bring to you today, and they are transformation and people's agency. Now, if you look at religion and Christianity in particular, too often religion has been defined, not just understood and existed, but defined as the supporter of the status quo. And this is the opposite of transformation and agency, right? This is especially true for Christianity supporting the status quo. It did not allow for transformation. It did not allow for people's agency. So what we need to do, and what's also been happening for 2,000 years, fortunately, is that we have to rethink Christianity once again. If you think back to the Jesus movement, this is a movement that's about transforming the world. It's not just about personal issues. It's really about building power in the community and throughout the Roman Empire of the time. This is true what scholars tell us, even for others, other writers in the New Testament. We knew that about James for sure, but it's also true about Paul, who is a much more critical and constructive thinker and a revolutionary in a way that we had never realized before. Well, perhaps we knew it, but we forgot about it, and now we have to relearn it. There are lessons here, I think, that course go back further. It's not Jesus and Paul inventing something that never existed, but they learned their lessons from the Jewish liberation traditions in the Hebrew Bible, the prophets, the Exodus, the exile. And so this is what's coming together here in this way of rethinking Christianity, where the key is, as I keep saying, transformation and agency. Think about it this way, agency in Jesus' own ministry. In the beginning of the Gospels, Jesus refuses the devil's offer of top-down power. Here's the devil offering him power over all the kingdoms of the world, just like the emperors of the time and every other ruler after. And Jesus refuses, not because he doesn't like power, but that's the power he rejects. He reclaims the power that gets built from the bottom up, from the people. In the beginning of the Gospel of Mark, when he heals a paralytic, you all know the story. He tells the paralytic, well, your sins are forgiven, and now take your mat and walk. Or in older translations, rise and walk, rise up and walk. That's that agency, people's agency, that's at the center of Christianity. It's not a top-down religion, but it's something that gets built up among the people. This is another way to look at the famous word discipleship. We talk about being Jesus's disciples, but what's really at stake here is building power together. Perhaps a better word for discipleship today would be organizing people for the common good, leading back to collective agencies, not just me or you, it's all of us together. It's leading to rising up, an uprising, the resurrection, and ultimately the transformation of the status quo. So that's Christianity in a nutshell. What's socialism in relation to that? Some people think it's the welfare state. They think it's big government, government control. And that, again, would be another opposition to transformation and agency, this sort of big apparatus that doesn't really value people's agency. Other people think socialism is membership in a specific party. Others, especially if you're an intellectual, you might think it's a certain body of literature, names that you can quote, books that you have read. But I want to push this a little bit further. While it may be all of that, socialism at its core is about transformation and people's agency. If you think about it this way, you get a different way of looking at it. Too oftentimes, people think socialism is about distribution and redistribution of wealth. Well, it may be that, but at its core is agency. At its core is actually production. It is the creative capacity of people to do things. It's creative energies, it's creative imaginative practice. This is not ableism because everyone can contribute. This includes children, this includes people with disabilities. This includes people that are usually not being recognized, but that's the core of it. Moving from simply the question of a socialism of distribution, as Kautsky thought, Christianity was to a socialism of production, where the agency is in the hands of people. That was one of the big moves I made in my book, No Rising Tide, Theology, Economics, and the Future. If you think about it this way, you get democracy built in. You don't have to add democracy to socialism, but it is fundamentally democratic in a way that capitalism never was. There's a contrast between socialism and capitalism that is not what many people think it is. People think socialism is about handouts and entitlements. And they think capitalism is about being rewarded for hard work. The reality is exactly the opposite. Capitalism today is as much about handouts as anything. It's just about handouts to large corporations, too big to fail, trying to fix problems for Walmart, figuring out how we can give healthcare to Walmart workers. That's what capitalism is. The socialism of which I'm talking is about recognizing people for the work they're doing, recognizing working people, their agency, moving forward together, and then finding a way to really valuing everybody's contribution differently. That to me is what makes it worthwhile. And that's where I see a lot of overlaps between Christianity and socialism.
Thank you, Dr. Rieger. Thank you very much. Dr. West, good evening. You are muted, sir. You are muted. Thank you.
Sorry. Can you hear me all right now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Well, I've been looking at your lovely faces. I didn't know that you couldn't hear me when I opened my mouth, though. But I was just saying, I'm just so very blessed to be here, two of my dear sisters and brother here, and I'm just learning already. But very briefly, for me, it always begins on an existential note, which is what kind of human being do I really want to choose to be, given the brief trek from my mother's womb to tomb? And I situate myself in a particular tradition of a people, a great tradition of a grand people, because I can't even begin to talk about Christianity and socialism without understanding the ways in which to have 400 years of being so hated that Black folk keep dishing out these love warriors. 400 years of being so terrorized, we keep dishing out these freedom fighters. So 400 years of being traumatized, and we keep dishing out these wounded healers. And when you look at the great exemplars of the love warriors and the freedom fighters and the wounded healers that come from my side of town, building with the best of their ROOTS, but always willing to explore ROUTES all around the world. So rooted in our particularity, but wedded to a universality. I don't think it's an accident that Martin Luther King Jr., Ella Baker, A. Philip Randolph, Fannie Lou Hamer, James Baldwin. We can go on and on and on. These are exemplary love warriors, freedom fighters, and wounded healers who are socialists. Paul Ropes, and we can just go on and on and on. Now, most of them may have underwent character assassination or literal assassination. Malcolm X ends up socialist. I have to raise the question, as a fallen, finite creature that I am, cracked vessel that I am, I've got to learn and listen from these voices who have decided to be certain kind of human beings. Now, the degree to which the Christian pole and the socialist pole, they are in no way synonymous. Christianity is a way of life. It's a mode of being in the world. The early Karl Barth said, radical love and freedom, radical freedom in love. It's about a deep commitment to integrity, honesty, decency, generosity, and then the three virtues of the Christian life, of that faith, hope, and love, you see. Socialism is a particular organization of a society in which there's democratic accountability for elites at the top to ensure that the basic needs of citizens are satisfied and that the voices of people can shape their collective destiny. This is in the face of ecological catastrophe. It's in the face of economic catastrophe. It's in the face of patriarchal catastrophe, homophobic catastrophe, white supremacist catastrophe, in the face of political and personal catastrophe. Now, socialism will never be able to speak to the issues that have played such a fundamental role in my life, which is death, dread, despair, disappointment, disenchantment, and despondence. Socialism is concerned about the way in which institutions are organized. So it is a particular moment within a larger prophetic Christian Weltanschauung or prophetic Christian worldview. And so we're talking about overlap. We're not talking about identity claims. We're talking about what happens when you decide, as my dear sister Moe-Lobeda said, you decide to follow a Palestinian Jew named Jesus in the country, into the temple, running out the money changer with the troops on one side, the bankers inside, the intellectuals rationalizing the rule of the bankers and the troops alongside. And it means you're going to get in deep trouble. So the issue of courage, of fortitude, of the cost of discipleship, as our dear brother Dietrich Bonhoeffer put it, the cost. And for me, I know it sounds simplistic, but it's simple. And there's a big distinction between the simple and the simplistic. When I learned in Vacation Bible School at Shiloh Baptist Church, if the kingdom of God is within you, then everywhere you go, you ought to leave a little heaven behind. What kind of heaven behind are you going to leave? Psychically, spiritually, politically, economically, socially, involved with others, but also in your individual life.
Thank you for that, Dr. West. Thank you. I'm going to ask Dr. Rieger now to answer the beginning of question number 2 to our panelists. What figures, traditions, or movements of emancipatory Christianity have formed and shaped you? Dr. Rieger, we'll start with you, then Dr. Moe-Lobeda, and then Dr. West. Thank you. You're muted. Dr. Rieger, you're muted.
I have to unmute myself. Yeah, thank you so much for that reminder. You know, it really takes me all the way back to Jesus himself. I talked about him already in my previous answer, but what we're realizing today is that Jesus really was much more than a radical preacher, a wisdom sage, or something like that. There's some scholars that say Jesus was an organizer. And to me, that's a big thing. You know, this is what made him dangerous, the Roman Empire, and this is what makes people worry about you know, changing things, transformation today. It's one thing to talk about transformation and agency; it's another one to organize it. And you see this in Jesus's life in various ways. In Matthew 11, there's this passage where Jesus is John the Baptist disciples come to Jesus with this question: "Are you the one who is to come, or should we wait for somebody else?" And Jesus responds, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have good news brought to them." Now, all of that is collective. It's not just about individuals, but I always think the biggest miracle really is the last one. People believe that the dead can be raised before they believe that the good news is brought to the poor, because good news to the poor means you are no longer poor. You will no longer be poor. And in order to get there, you know, you need a really big miracle, which I think ultimately can only be produced through organizing. That's what you find in the Jesus movement. And not that the whole world was already converted at the time, but this is the sort of process that takes a while, and we're still working on it. So this is where I would add a few other names. I certainly was deeply impacted by personal relationships to some of the founders of liberation theologies really in plural. Gustavo Gutierrez in Peru, Frederick Herzog, my own teacher at Duke University, Rosemary Radford Ruther, James Cone, and others. We have Cornel West with us tonight, which is a great honor to be in your presence. Cornel, thank you so much for being with us. What I've learned from these thinkers, though, is really important, because they help me to think in relation to practical commitments. So this is not idealism or utopian ideas or great dreams. It's not putting ideas into practice. This is what the Academy still says. but it's really thinking about God from the midst of the struggle, figuring out who is God in that situation, what difference does it make, and then to move your way forward. That's a practical thing, that's a theoretical thing. This is the sort of thing that's going on all around us. I also want to name the younger generations in theology. This is my colleagues Kwok Pui-Lan, Asian American woman theologian, my colleague Jung Mo-Sung from Brazil, Nestor Miguez from Argentina. I've co-authored books with each of them. With Pui-Lan, we wrote a book, Beyond the Spirit of Empire, that was commenting on the Occupy Wall Street movement as a liberative movement. Theology of the Multitude was the subtitle. With Jung Mo-Sung and Nestor Miguez, we co-authored a book, Beyond the Spirit of Empire. I've learned more than I contributed probably in these projects, but these are the things that keep moving me. And I would be remiss if I didn't add at the end of this also my own rootedness in the Wesleyan holiness traditions. Because these traditions emerged in conjunction with the rise of capitalism. This is not always known. People think this is a narrow spiritual personal thing, but it's really a big thing that ultimately have to do not only with addressing capitalism, but with organizing, again, working people. The early labor organizers in England were oftentimes Methodists. The practical engagement in the fields were part of the sacraments, the means of grace in Methodism. And the realization was the same for all of these. You connect to God by connecting to other people, by connecting to those who struggle. This is what Jesus realized. This is what the liberation theologians, what the prophets taught us. And this is certainly something that you find even in some of these Methodist traditions. Once wrote a little book about Methodism where I took a title from Ernest Hemingway, Grace Under Pressure. If there's grace, it only shows up under pressure. It's never a mountaintop thing. It's never a thing of the privileged. It's always something that moves the other way around. And that's happened throughout history. It certainly happened throughout the history of Christianity. And I believe it's happening again today, which is why I'm really excited to be part of this group.
Thank you, Dr. Rieger. Thank you very much. Dr. Moe-Lobeda, please.
I've been profoundly influenced by so many movements and people, but I'd like to note a kind of unlikely combination of Martin Luther and Latin American liberation theology practitioners in the late 70s and early 90s, and the Beguines, a medieval movement of radical women, and womanist theoethicists. In my early 20s, while working and living in Central America, I encountered and I worked with campesinos and leaders of base Christian communities and other practitioners of liberation theology, although they did not all use that term. And I was blown away by their courage. Dr. West, you mentioned courage, and it was their courage, blatant courage in the fights for justice. They shaped my life, and they are still with me. Later, I began to follow my instincts. Later, after having left the church and come back to the church, I was following this instinct that Christian traditions hold incredible sources of power for challenging systemic injustice. And I wanted to get to know faith forebearers who challenged a dominant political economy that was assumed to be inevitable and challenged the social construction of Christianity in their time, and did so out of a deep sense of God's indwelling presence within. And I landed for a time on Martin Luther and the Beguines, and both of them have influenced me tremendously. As an ecofeminist liberationist working with Luther, I certainly honed my skills in combining appreciation with deep critique and retrieval. There is a great deal to critique in Martin Luther. And there's a great deal to retrieve in his work that has been ignored, largely ignored by North Atlantic Lutheranisms, especially his radical economic ethics that denounced explicitly and theologically denounced the emerging capitalism of his day. He insisted, for example, that Christians could not charge what the market will bear for essential goods, because so doing would damage the poor. Get that, any of us who own mutual funds right now. I was reading Luther while the WTO protests were going on in Seattle. I don't know if folks remember those, but as I was reading Luther, I was in those protests, and I began to see that Luther's words denouncing what he called the liberal market economy were almost identical to the words of the protesters denouncing the neoliberal global capitalism. And I tested out this hearing of the same words. I was giving a lecture at a university in South Dakota, and I read words from the protesters and words from Luther and asked people to vote, indicating who they thought they were. I interspersed the words and they couldn't tell the difference. So it influenced me to continue to pursue the theological roots of his critique of emerging capitalism. Much earlier in my life, he had influenced me in another way. Together with the Apostle Paul, mediated by a river and a forest and a kind elder, he helped free me from a guilt that was shattering and debilitating. It had taken over my psyche as a teenager when I began to recognize the magnitude of the brutality that was wrought around the world by the combined forces of US imperialism and corporate power. As an idealistic young person, I came to hate myself for being a white middle-class American, and it was a horrible kind of hatred. The story is too long to tell here, but I turned to a former youth director in my despair. He took me to a creek in the forest and read to me from Romans about the unconditional love of God, and I was overwhelmed, embraced, engulfed, emblazed with a sense that I was beloved, regardless of what. That has shaped me. Now I know fully that every person on earth is infinitely beloved and precious and has all the rights and needs of other persons. And that knowledge is part of the energy that fuels me. I was also influenced at some point in my middle school years by a single lecture given by William Stringfellow. And that helped to shape my future from that early point in my life. And I would say that more recently, in the last 5 to 10 years, womanist theoethicists, and particularly Emily Towns, have been guiding my understanding and my praxis, and have shaped my understanding of neighbor love and my understanding of the human being's relationship to God and its relationship to social transformation. So I am deeply indebted to womanist theological ethicists for what they have given me in the last decade of my life. And I could go on forever, Dr. Kauser, but I'll stop there because we have others to hear.
Thank you for such a fulsome and beautiful and moving answer. Thank you very much. Dr. West.
Well, it's just marvelous to be here. I'll be very brief because I try to be ecumenical in terms of my sources of inspiration. But I'll be very selective tonight because when I think first of the organic intellectuals who have made such an impact on my sense of vocation, Gerard Winstanley of the English revolutionary moment, using Christian faith to bring powerful critique to bear. David Walker's great appeal, colored citizens of the world. Deep Christian insight and back to courage again. See, he knew he'd be dead, which he was.
Mm.
Just a few months later, of course, in the hotel here in Boston. I think of R.H. Tawney. I think of early Reinhold Niebuhr. The later establishmentarian Niebuhr is a different question. Moral Man and the Moral Society has had tremendous impact on me. No doubt. Howard Thurman, very much so. Bell Hooks, very much so. Gustavo Gutierrez, who I was blessed to teach with in the 70s with Cone, taught a big course on Walter Rauschenbusch when Gustavo came from Peru. Miles Horton has meant the world to me, but brother founded the Highlander Center with his wife, who's a co-writer of the We Shall Overcome, the great anthem, the Black Freedom Movement, written by Vanilla Sisters. Very interesting. You see, that's the embrace. That's the solidarity. It's not about narrow neoliberal discourse about identity weaponized in order to find a place in the class hierarchy and in the imperial hierarchy. But it's grounded in an integrity and solidarity for the fundamental transformation. Back to my dear brother's point, transformation of that imperial hierarchy in the directed towards those Frantz Fanon called the wretched of the earth. And of course, I mean, you know, Jim Cone and Martin King and Malcolm X and Fannie Lou Hamer. But one last point I'll make, and that is the artists and the musicians. The everyday people on the ground who are willing to be so visionary and courageous, who constitute a kind of leadership that's often invisible. But when it does surface, it's often in an artistic way in raising their voices. And see, I come from a people whose options have been so truncated. Pharaoh is on every side of the bloody Red Seas. And so you have to sing a song just to keep moving. In the lion's den, that's American slavery. In the lion's den, that's American neo-slavery, Jim Crow. In the lion's den, that's mass incarceration, the new Jim Crow, and so forth, you see. So that when I think of inspiration, I think intellectual, I think artistic, I think organizing, but in the end, as a follower of a Palestinian Jew named Jesus, it is spiritual, to be fortified in order to fructify, to having your whole armor on in order to engage in courageous praxis, deeds, action that is informed by reflection, but in the end, it is about kenosis. That's what it is to follow Jesus. Must Jesus better cross alone and all the world go free? No, there's a cross for everyone. And there's a cross for me. Pick up your cross and follow me with a smile, with joy, because you're serving others. See, that for me is the bottom line for Christian life, Christian faith, Christian love, Christian hope.
Woo, Jesus, thank you. I'm supposed to be moderating, and I'm praising God while I'm sitting. Thank you very much, panelists, for that fulsome and marvelous answer to question number 2. I'm going to skip question number 3 and move to number 4 in the interest of keeping us on time. Progressive Christians in the United States, broadly construed, are committed to justice, freedom, emancipation, and liberation in all categories of human endeavor and existence for all people. Here is the question: why should progressive Christians who are committed to justice, freedom, emancipation, and liberation in all categories of human existence become socialist Christians? In other words, what is the difference, if any, between a progressive Christian and a socialist Christian? Dr. West, I will start with you.
Oh, wonderful question. I'm going to be very, 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 very brief. Look at someone like our dear sister Thea Harris and our dear brother Barbara, head of the Poor People's Campaign, building on the legacy of Fannie Lou Hamer and Martin Luther King Jr., and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, and the great Dorothy Day, our vanilla sister, Catholic. Now, I'm left-wing Reformation. I'm still way out with the Baptists, and most of my fellow Baptists would, you know, push me off a cliff with a smile. but I love them anyway. They made in the image of God and they can change. I'm just not banking a program on they change in the next couple of years. But when you look at those two figures, are they socialist? Are they progressive? Fascinating question. It blurs into a certain kind of socialist sensibility. So that in that sense, you know, I'm less concerned about the ism and I'm more concerned about the courage and the prophetic witness and the willingness to focus on precious, poor, and working people, no matter what color they are, calling for a multiracial solidarity.
Dr. Moe-Lobeda?
Gotta unmute there. Practicing justice, freedom, emancipation, liberation, by definition, includes seeking to dismantle racism, seeking liberation from white supremacy and the racist structuring of society to privilege whiteness. That in itself is a massive realignment of life, including basic consciousness for white people. Many Christians, individuals, denominations, and congregations are moving in that direction, fallibly, feebly, haltingly, but moving there. However, a necessary but often ignored aspect of dismantling racism is recognizing its ties with capitalism. The two are woven together, at least in US history. And it is so much easier and more comfortable not to see this. The material wealth of this country has been built since before its inception on the brutalization and exploitation of Black and Brown and Asian and Indigenous bodies. That continues. And it continues in part because capitalism as we know it calls for maximizing short-term financial profit. And that calls for maximizing consumption and efficiency. Profit and consumption and efficiency are not inherently bad. If we did not consume, we would not exist. But maximizing them is deadly. It means not counting the costs that are beyond the financial bottom line, the sometimes deadly costs to exploited human beings and Earth's life systems. So to undo racism as a basic organizing principle of US society, we must undo the economic practices and policies and presuppositions that are all tangled up with racism. And the necessary flip side of dismantling oppressive economic structures is rebuilding more equitable, ecological, and democratic economic structures. That work, of course, goes by many names, but current efforts to build such economies are situated in the trajectory of democratic socialisms and have invaluable wisdom to gain from that trajectory, including the Anglican socialist movements of England, the Christian Socialisms of Germany, the social gospel of the US, and the religiously rooted socialisms arising in the global South. Neoliberal capitalism counters liberation and justice in many other ways. 3 of them are particularly real to me. First, it concentrates wealth by providing some with wealth in the billions while relegating others to poverty. Second, by concentrating wealth, it concentrates power, thus undercutting democracy. And third, neoliberal capitalism requires economic practices that spew forth mountains of greenhouse gases, leading to climate change that strikes most viciously at already impoverished people. So, in short, neoliberal capitalism is a threat to social equity, to democratic tendencies and trajectories, and to Earth's fragile life systems. So, for these reasons, the Christian commitment to emancipation, which is where you began, emancipation and justice, means also a commitment to build alternatives to capitalism as we know it. And that is the terrain of democratic socialisms, including the new forms that are emerging today. Progressive Christians will gain invaluable tools from that terrain, lessons to be found in its ongoing history. Moreover, Christians can find in Christian democratic socialisms, Christians can find a company of faith forebearers from whom to learn and gain inspiration and encouragement, both from their mistakes and from their wisdoms. So these are just a few of the reasons why socialism is an invaluable landing place for progressive Christians. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Mhm.
Thank you. Dr. Rieger.
Yes, thank you. There's so much going on here. I'm really excited to hear my colleagues here and to see all the excitement that's going on in the chat is
Oh,
just
yes.
fascinating as well. So thank you. I wish we could all be in a big room and have these conversations over a series of days rather than just one evening. But here's my response to this relation of progressive Christians and maybe a socialist Christianity. I moved to Vanderbilt a few years ago because I believe that Vanderbilt is one of the great progressive Christian, not just Christian, but certainly religious and interreligious schools of theology in the country. There are others, but the reason we founded the Wendland-Cook Program that I directed is precisely to address this. How can progressive and Christians on the left really keep working together? Some of what was said already, I would agree with. But I want to add two things. First one is, people are oftentimes afraid of socialism because it contains a critique of religion. And then, people are even more afraid of terms like atheism. But we have to remind ourselves that atheism is really a rejection of false theisms. It's not necessarily the rejection of all gods, but it is certainly the rejection of dominant theisms. When the early Christians were called atheists by the Romans, they could recognize themselves because they really did not believe in the gods of the empire. Whereas the empire was very tolerant, very open-minded, wanted to accept everything and everybody, except, of course, those who worshiped a god who was not like the empire. So that's the first thing. And here, I think, progressive Christians sometimes have a bit of a lack of a critique of religion, not because religion is good or bad, but because it doesn't really quite get us through to this radical rejection of the gods of the empire in favor of the God of Jesus Christ. So we're not rejecting all gods, but we have a very different idea of who is God. That's one thing. The other thing is, and this is maybe a specific issue in the United States, where U.S. Christians and U.S. population in general have a strong concern for politics, which is good. That's part of our heritage that comes back, goes back to our own struggles for independence, the revolutionary times and wars and so on, which are crucial. But the socialist traditions in conversation with that encourage us to pay attention not just to politics, but also to economics. This is crucial because there's a field of engagement that many Americans don't recognize. You have, for good reason, some suspicion about politics and big government in the US, but there's surprisingly little suspicion about big corporations. And oftentimes churches and religions themselves become big corporations and don't even see what's going on. So there's class struggle happening, not just in society, but even in the church, because you can only say certain things in the church if you're backed up by the donors and by where the money flows. So here I would encourage our progressive brothers and sisters to ask some of these questions, to bring them into our theological work. Keep in mind, theology and religion is not mainly about leisure time, it's about life, and life is political, and economic leisure is part of it, but it's not perhaps the only thing. Democratic traditions, then, this is where I want to conclude here with my comment, are certainly at the core, certainly of progressive Christianity, but also of socialist Christianity. But I think we need to expand this conversation about democracy. While we're all agreed that political democracy is a good thing, we also need to talk about what economic democracy might look like. What does it mean that people that have political rights to vote oftentimes walk into their places of work where they spend the bulk of their waking hours not having any democracy, not having any power? It's not just about how much money you make. It's not just about what's your position in the company, but what is your democratic life there? You know, how do you relate to others? How do you relate to fellow workers? How do you relate to the company, and so on? These are crucial economic questions that I believe feed back into political democracy and ultimately into religious democracy as well. It's those kinds of things that need to be brought together. And I think in this conversation between progressive Christianity and socialist traditions, this is where we could still learn. Ultimately, what is fought here, let me be very clear, it's not just matters of economics, it's not just matters of politics, it's not just matters of money, it's also matters of how we resolve tensions of race, tensions of ethnicity, immigration, gender, sexuality. All of these liberations are tied together. In progressives, I think Cynthia put this really well, oftentimes, have a bit of a tunnel vision, not really opening their minds to the broader connections.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rieger, Dr. Moe-Lobeda, Dr. West. Our final question, and I want to acknowledge you all that we are 15 to 20 minutes ahead of time, so please feel free to stretch out to answer this final question. As we bring this first webinar to a close, we began the night by talking about the religious right and their commitments to organizing around authoritarianism and fascism. What should a church committed to socialist Christianity be doing to bring in the kingdom of God, most especially for poor people on this side of glory? Dr. Moe-Lobeda, will begin with you. Thank you. You are muted.
Sorry, I can't remember to unmute myself, I guess. I think first I would say that I don't see the church as doing this for poor people, but rather with and as poor people. And I also learned not from a friend of the Global South not to call poor people, but rather impoverished, because systems have made them poor. So I'm going to toss that out as a part of my response. But then I also need to say that I am a Lutheran, critically situated in that tradition. And as such, I have a really strong theology of sin, especially structural sin. I have a book on resisting structural evil. That's the name of it, Getting at Structural Sin. But anyway, it means I don't really think we will bring in the kingdom of God, this side of glory, but that we will seek to build ways of living that are far more aligned with the kingdom of God, this side of glory. And that said, this is an excellent question. This is a beautiful question. What should a church committed to socialist Christianity do toward that end of bringing us closer to the ways of life that go with God's will of abundant life for all?
Yes.
There is so much to say, but I think I'll respond out of my own experience. I think that we would all be wise to practice what I call critical mystical vision, which means seeing three things ever more fully at one time. And the first of those is seeing what is going on, especially uncovering structural evil, where it, in Bonhoeffer's terms, where it parades as good. That means daring to see honestly the consequences of global capitalism as we live it now, the consequences for Earth's fragile climate, and the brutal consequences for so many human beings.
Yes.
They are in my working in India on eco-justice matters and looking at the lands that were destroyed by Coca-Cola plants and everything, you know, all over the consequences for human beings. However, seeing this way is tormenting. From facing realities like this, people flee. I certainly do. It's far easier to walk in paths of denial. And where denial thaws, despair, subtle, spoken despair about the power of systemic injustice just makes sense. As I have said before, that happened to me as a young person when I began to see the horrors of US economic imperialism. And for years, after a few years of activism, I fell into despair. So I know at the core of my being that seeing what is going on has to be accompanied by two other forms of seeing. Like I said, it's courageous to see what's going on. It's deadly, it's horrifying. So the two other forms of seeing, as I understand it, one is seeing what could and should be. That is, more socially just and ecologically sane and compassionate forms of economic life already in the making, in our backyards and around the globe. Church communities, what we can do, we can jump in to learn all that we can, for instance, about what new socialist movements are saying and proposing. Read the Bias magazine. Read the summer 2020 issue of Tikkun magazine regarding socialism. Learn the history of Christian democratic socialisms. Read Gary Dorian's books and many others. Sit with this history as our ancestral lineage, drawing upon it, studying it, claim ourselves as the descendants of resistors, grounded and encouraged by faith in God. Connect to current democratic socialist movements here and around the globe, and practice defying the myth that capitalism depends upon. It depends upon many myths, but one in particular is that it is inevitable, impenetrable, unchangeable. That is the myth that I've learned people believe in speaking all around the country. We can't really change it. So practice defying that myth. We can practice defying that myth on three levels. Practice it in our behaviors. What we buy, what we invest, what we eat, how we transport ourselves. Practice it in working for social structural change through community organizing, through public policy advocacy, through social movements and demonstrations. And practice it on the level of worldview and consciousness change. Who are we on this earth anyway? What is our purpose? We are so socialized to believe we are first and foremost individuals, serving individual interest alone. So what I'm saying is to link together the practice of what could be by working on those three levels, our behaviors and lifestyles as individuals and congregations, etc. Our work on structural change, and our work on worldview change. And that is partly the work of liturgy and theology, taking seriously what our Eucharist means and what our baptism means. So the second mode of vision is seeing and practicing what could be. But then there's a third mode of vision in what I call critical mystical vision. And the third mode is seeing the power and presence of that intimate mystery that we so lamely call God at work in the world, luring us, leading us from what is toward what could be. And that includes, of course, what could be economic practices and policies and principles that enable all people to have the necessities for life in its fullness and allow Earth's ecosystems to flourish. Never ought we lose sight of this third vision, the life-transforming, sacred, liberating, healing presence, calling us forth, but living within us as communities, as connected bodies. What is, what could be, God's liberating presence, training our sights on these three at once, and then resisting the first, the way things are, practicing the second, what could be, and embodying the third, the presence of the transformative power of the universe within us. This is at the heart of what it means to be the church. This is what we can do as body of God's liberating love on earth.
Jesus. I'm gonna go off the road for just a second, and then I'm gonna get back on the main road. My follow-up question to you would be, what then, as we are all theological educators, what then, how would we restructure or rethink a curriculum for both master's level students, doctoral level students, and continuing education for pastors who are in congregations, for clergy who are in congregations, who are struggling mightily to hold head and body and soul together in the struggle of the pandemics, the multiple pandemics. That's I'm just going to put that out there. We're going to come back to the main question if we have time. I'd like to put that to both of you. Dr. West, if you could stretch out and tell us, what would a church committed to socialist Christianity be doing to bring in the kingdom of God, most especially with people who have been made poor on this side of glory? Thank you.
I just love this line of thinking about seeing. And what's wonderful about the conversation is jazz, like you bounce off the different voices and you can kind of improvise based on these wonderful insights and wisdom. And you're orchestrating is like Mary Lou Williams on the piano. You know, you just smooth orchestrating our voices in a beautiful way. And we
do play the violin, Dr. West.
Oh,
that's another book trajectory, but go ahead.
That's it, my dear sister professor. But you know, there's a wonderful letter that Henry James wrote to Robert Louis Stevenson on January 12, 1901, where he said, "No theory is kind to us that cheats us of seeing." So that we understand Christianity as a way of being in the world, then theory is indispensable, is crucial, but you also wear it like a loose garment to the degree to which you acknowledge it has blind spots. And all theories have blind spots. But some theories do allow us to see empire. We see class struggle. We see patriarchal subordination and resistance. We see homophobic degradation and resilience. And we see white supremacy. But there's another whole host of theories, too many in our curriculums, that don't even allow our precious students to see it. It's too narrow. The framework's too truncated. It's too parochial and provincial.
Mm.
But I would want to go beyond the seeing in this sense. And Sister Cynthia, you tell me what you think, and also all of us together. That John 1:14, the word made flesh and came to dwell among us. The seeing is inseparable from the feeling more deeply. The hypersensitivity to the suffering of others because they are one made in the image and likeness of God, but also with sentient creatures. I mean, Schopenhauer loved dogs. I'm with Arthur on that. You know what I mean? So that the hypersensitivity to suffering of others means that seeing any theory that cheats us of feeling more deeply about the suffering of others needs to be called into question. And then in the end, it's any theory is not kind to us that cheats us of being able to act courageously. Because one of the things in talking about the United States and the left and socialism is that the United States has a vicious repressive apparatus. Some of you probably seen Judas and the Black Messiah with our dear brother Fred Hampton, which is the peak of an iceberg in terms of the unbelievable levels of repression that has been targeted at socialists. Harry Ward at Union Seminary, he needs to be a household name when we talk about this.
Yeah.
You see it? And the Arnold Johnsons and so forth and so on. These are folk who did opt for a particular kind of socialist alternative, and then boom, there's the Smith Act. Boom, there's incarceration. Boom, there's deportation. Claudia Jones. We can go on and on and on, you see. And so there is this vicious underside, and this is very real where we are right now in terms of the neo-fascists and 900 white supremacist militia groups. Some of us have our names on that list to be targeted. You see, that's what it is to live as a Christian with a certain cost, not falling into the trap of hatred or drinking from the bitter cup, the cup of bitterness. You still have a certain acknowledgement of their humanity, but the reason why we are weak and feeble is one, we don't have a constructive vision and analysis and project and program, and because when we have attempted to do that, they have tried to crush us like cockroaches. And who's the they? FBI, CIA, international. Who's the they? The police. Who's the they? The spies on the inside, the informants, and so forth and so on. So we have to be very honest about that first moment of seeing what is, and yet still being able to respond creatively. You know, they say Beethoven used to get up every morning. I know it's probably apocryphal, but it sounds good. He used to say, how do I unflinchingly look at the darkness and grimness of the world and still muster the courage to love beauty? Here's Opus 131 string quartet. What you gonna do with that? Ludwig, thank you, thank you, thank you. How do you look and see the ugliness and yet still generate the goodness and the beauty and the holy? Oh, that's the blues. So that the artists again play an important role, given just how ugly that that repression has been in talking about socialists and Christian socialists in the United States. And it's true in other parts of the world. You know?
Lord Jesus, what would our Sunday schools look like if we had a constructive analysis, vision, and organize it as at the center of the Sunday school? Ooh, let me get to Dr. Rieger.
But we used to do that. We used to do that right here in Boston when I was superintendent of the Sunday school at Mount Pleasant Baptist Church under Boykin Sanders, where we had the Panther Breakfast program during the week, and we had the kids in the Sunday school on Sunday, and we had Jesus at the center. But shoot, we had some Franz Fanon. We had some Mary Daly back then. We had some Mary Daly. She was right at Boston College. She'd come in and blow their mind. blow our mind. It blew my mind. But the important thing is we had an all-embracing dialogue, though we acknowledge that we put this Palestinian Jew named Jesus, the Christocentric content right at the core. I'm sorry to keep jumping in like that, but I'm just giving you examples.
No.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just agitating my spirit, and I'm loving it. I'm loving it. Dr. Rieger, you're going to bring us home with the final answer to this question: what should a church committed to socialist Christianity be doing to bring in the kingdom of God, most especially with people who have been made poor on this side of glory?
So you're asking me to do the altar call. I think in a way, we'll see how far I can get.
Yes.
I'm always calling myself back to the altar for sure. And that's where I want to start really, because I talked about atheism there a minute ago, right? From one of my teachers, Frederick Herzog, I learned that if you want to be a good theologian, you have to have become an atheist in the face of pain. In other words, your theisms have to go out the window in the search for the true God. And I think that's the starting point. We have to reclaim not just our visions of God, but our experience of God. We have to look for God in the places where we might not suspect that God is at work. Eberhard Bethge, one of the main biographer of Bonhoeffer, put it this way. He said Bonhoeffer believed that if you want to find God, you have to follow God where God has preceded us. And that means, of course, God is everywhere to some degree, but we really have to look for where God is at work, where Jesus was at work. What is Jesus doing now, right? All these things. And once you start looking there, this will change not only the way of the church and the way of Christianity, but it may be changing the world of religion in general, looking for God in these different places. This is not just an intellectual question, even though I'm a systematic constructive theologian. This is a matter of reclaiming a relationship with God and with other people. Now, keep in mind, when I say relationship, my main worry is not individualism. A lot of people say, well, individualism is the big problem. Well, individualism is the myth of the powerful. They want us to believe that they have built it all themselves. Yet the person at the top who claims to be the individualist who built it all by themselves is really the most connected person of all. It's just that we don't see the connections. We don't make them visible. There is a distorted relationship. There are many distorted relationships in place. And in order to come to true relationships, we have to address those. This is the question of the relationship of labor, first of all. Who is exploiting whom, who benefits from whose work. Once that's asked, once that's resolved, it seems to me we can really start building new relationships with each other and ultimately with God as well. Want to emphasize two things here in conjunction with that. One is about ecology, and the other one is about economics. Everybody knows that ecology is also a matter of relationship, right? We're all clear about that. But what kinds of relationship? And here I think we're sometimes fudging a bit. We're not talking about the Anthropocene, which according to some people means that humanity, there are now so many of us that we're destroying the planet. But if you look at the numbers, the 100 largest corporations in the world are responsible for 70% of CO2 emissions in the world. So it's not all of humanity. It's really certain powerful interests, certain interests of power, might, and wealth, if you want to put it this way. That has to be addressed in order to reshape relationships. So maybe we're not living in the Anthropocene, but in the Capitalocene. And if you want to change something, we have to face it. You can really talk much more about ecological relationships, agency of people. I talked about transformation and agency in the beginning. I'll come back to it now. Agency and transformative power of people, but also agency of nature, agency of the non-human creation, as it were, talking about animals, other animals than us, right? Talking about plants and all of the rest. Those are things that have to be reconsidered. In the Wendland-Cook program, we have done a webinar series on liberating people in the planet, because we realize that which is oppressing people is also that which is ultimately oppressing and exploiting the planet. These two things are connected, and we cannot resolve them without each other. Which brings me to my final point here, economics. There's a good deal of production now in our field on theology and economics, religion and economics, but surprisingly little on theology and labor. Economics and labor are still miles and miles apart. Some people think, basically we need some new economic ideas. Well, what if we needed new labor relationships? What if we needed new relationships to work with each other, new ways to cooperate with each other? Keep in mind, the 99% are defined as the working majority. These are the people that have to work for a living. These are the people who are not directly benefiting from the powers that be. This is the place for solidarity. So economics and labor here leads us back to this question of solidarity. That's not just a beautiful ideal. That is saying we are really welded together because the forces of destruction eventually will kill us all, people and the planet. And unless we see that, unless we band together over that, we cannot really win it. Now, when I say solidarity, I sometimes use the term deep solidarity, which may be borrowed from ecology. And this is a way of saying we don't all have to march in lockstep. We don't all have to, look alike, talk alike, sing alike, pray alike, worship alike. What's much more important is that we bring our diversities to bear. This is also the place for interreligious relationships, not just a matter of looking at Christianity as this progressive force. It's a matter of reclaiming every religion for this progressive force. And you have to realize that the line between oppressive and liberative runs through each of the religions themselves. This was one of my points in a recent book of mine, Jesus versus Caesar, saying we have to figure out how Christianity itself is part of the problem. But that's true for all the other religions too. And then the interreligious and ecumenical relationship is among the liberative sides, among those of all religions and among those with no religion. This is not a matter of, just talking among religious people here. Solidarity then becomes a way of working together, realizing, as Paul said, if one member suffers, all suffer together with it, or as the unions say, an injury to one is an injury to all. And to ask the question, where is God in all of this? And then it's not enough to say God is everywhere or God is some obscure power of mystery, but then you have to put your finger on it. You have to put your money where your mouth is, as it were, figuring out where God is at work, and to put your shoulder to the wheel at that place. I want to conclude specifically by talking about labor and the labor movement, because this is another sore topic in the United States. I once had a student who was curious about socialism, who thought you become a socialist by joining a socialist party. Well, maybe you do, but more important, it seems to me, is that you understand that they're working people, that you're probably one of them, chances are, even if you're a professor, and that you have to start rethinking the world from there, and not just rethinking, but reacting and developing new kinds of agencies and relationships from there. That means we have to reclaim labor relationships. We have to rethink the work of the unions, work with the unions. My wife and I wrote a book on that, Unified Warrior Force, how faith and labor can overcome America's inequalities. That was published a few years ago based on our experiences in Dallas. Another one is worker centers, alt labor, as I sometimes call it, the labor movement that's outside of the unions. And maybe a final one that's important for us here at the Wendland-Cook Program is worker co-ops. We're working at a project right now with the Southeast Center for Cooperative Development that brings together worker cooperatives, and religious communities. If anybody is interested, drop us a note, because we're really looking for collaborators on that. It seems to us that this is a way of really not just moving labor, politics, and the world forward, but really also religion. Religion cannot do it. We cannot pull ourselves up by our own religious bootstraps. We have to do it together in terms of where God is at work. And that's ultimately is the spiritual question, I think, that both my colleagues were raising as well.
Thank you, Dr. Rieger. Dr. Moe-Lobeda, yes, please.
Angela, Dr. Kauser, you asked a question about seminary education. What it should be in light of some of what we've heard here. And I'm wondering if I could have just 1 minute to make a response to that.
I'll hold you to that, and then we will close out, please.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
I think it's a crucial question, and we're working with it at a little but mighty seminary, Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary. And one of the things we've landed on is we now have a required course in community organizing as spiritual practice. Mm-hmm. And we teach all students at the beginning of their time, do a 5-day training in community organizing, but it's done also using the arts and using Bible and theology. And we wed it to a course called Intro to Faith-Based Social Transformation, which is wedded to a course called Preaching for Social Transformation. And all of this we really ground theologically, including in Luther's freedom theology and many other theological entrees. So I think I wanted to, and then one of our main commitments is to prepare students for ministry at the nexus of race, class, gender, and earth. So that pervades the curriculum. Race, class, gender, and earth. And now we have a new concentration and a new certificate that enables our students to study also with people from around the world, including people from the Global South working on climate justice. And so I really think that this question of rethinking theological education to enable transformative ministry is crucial. And those are just some of the little pathways that we're going that seem to shine a lot of light and bring a lot of hope for us at PLTS.
I would take that. I would do that. And I think it's also not an accident that your president, your provost is an organizer.
Oh, yes, Dr. Ray Pickett.
Absolutely, yes.
He's our rector.
Right, rector,
and in fact, he co-leads the community organizing course with me and 2 incredible community organizers.
Yes.
Yeah.
Let us end on time. Let me summarize briefly and then give you some final notes. What does it mean for you to be both to think about Christianity and socialism? We took that question and really digested it. We looked at figures, traditions, and movements of emancipatory Christianity that have shaped and formed your lives. We have looked at the difference between progressive Christianity and socialist Christianity and really argued back and forth what that would look like. We looked at what a socialist Christianity would be doing to approximate the kingdom of God with people who've been made poor on this side of glory. We looked very briefly at theological education, just a peek at that. We might want to consider that for sessions 2 and 3. Here is some final housekeeping. Webinar 2 will be April 12th, 7 p.m. Central Time. How can Christian socialists build deeper solidarities? That's number 2. Number 3, and the final one will be May 10th, 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. What is to be done? The final piece that I want to tell you about is a new webinar series called Capital Change, the End of Religion and Business as Usual. That will be hosted by Drs. Joerg Rieger and Dr. Tripp Fuller. You should find contact information somewhere in this chat. And I need you all to know, Dr. West, Dr. Rieger, Dr. Moe-Lobeda, that the chat, there are probably thousands of items here in this chat. So it has been a work of focusing on you all, to focus on you all, and not the thousands of comments that we've had. because of the generative and wonderful conversation that we've had tonight. I want to thank you all for your time on behalf of Wendland-Cook and ICS. We bid you strength as you continue your work for justice, solidarity in the struggle for social and political and economic and ecological salvation, and the full flowering of the kingdom of God on earth as it is in heaven. We bid you a good night. Thank you and bless each of you, and we will see you in the struggle. Bless you. Peace out.
Yes, good night.
Good night.
You were wonderful. You were wonderful. All of you all were wonderful.
Oh, wonderful.
It was beautiful.
It was beautiful.
It was
Beautiful orchestra. Beautiful symphony. Thank you.
Beautiful symphony.
Beautiful.